God, please don't act on these 2 cornfields. I want to make sure that it's the fertilizer that makes it grow. You can't put God in a test tube, right? You cannot test explanations involving supernatural cause, involving an omnipotent cause, because any outcome you get is compatible with the actions of that omnipotent cause. That's what omnipotence is all about. It's very useful. But because of that, because we can't test statements about God's actions, we just leave them out of science.
I think perhaps the best way to explain it is in terms of Sir Isaac Newton, probably the most gifted scientist who's ever lived. When he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now I understand how the planets move, so I don't need God. Not at all. In fact, the more he understood, the more he worshipped God who'd done it that clever way. So he wasn't believing in a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. He was saying, I can explain it to a certain extent. And these explanations are so wonderful and they can be compressed so brilliantly into mathematical formulae that that is evidence of God. It was Kepler who first of all suggested the planets moved in ellipses, that said that it was so wonderful that God had revealed the way things worked and that we could describe them in the language of mathematics. And then he talked about thinking God's thoughts after him. All of these people, their worship for God and their admiration and faith in God was increased by what they understood, not by what they didn't understand.
But as my friend Robert Pennock said, another Michigan scholar, to say nothing of God is not to say that God is nothing. When we talk about cell division in biology, we don't say, here are the enzymes that cause the chromosomes to line up in the midline, and God had nothing to do with it. And here are the enzymes that form the spindle fibers, and God had nothing to do with it. And here are the enzymes that make the cell break apart, and God had nothing to do with it. Of course not. When we talk about evolution, we talk about the phylogenies, we talk about the tree of life, we talk about how bears and dogs had a common ancestor in the Miocene. We're not saying, and God had nothing to do with it, because we don't talk about God acting or not acting when we're wearing our scientist hat. If as a religious individual you want to believe that God wanted bears and dogs to emerge out of a common ancestor, there's nothing in science that's going to say you can't say that. But there's nothing in science that you can use to test that either. And it's not a scientific idea because it's not testable. Okay? That's methodological materialism or methodological naturalism. There's also something called philosophical materialism. This is a philosophical view, not a scientific view, that says matter and energy is it, folks. There is no God, there are no ancestor spirits, there's no supernatural whatsoever. Matter, energy, and their interactions is all that the universe is composed of. This is a philosophical view, it's held by a lot of people, but it is not a view that is compelled by science. Okay? I happen to hold that view, but I can't say that science proves that point of view. I have to say I hold that view because of my own particular background and what I think about reality. But a theist can look at the same empirical evidence that I look at, and given his particular philosophical view, see the hand of God and so forth. I don't. Science is an equal opportunity substratum for philosophy, okay? It does not compel either theism or disbelief or philosophical materialism.
We use reason in all areas, even in understanding revelation. The point is there are different sources of information. One of them is the study of nature. And the other is, as I believe, the book of God's Word. And when God reveals something in His Word, we don't shut our reason. In fact, we need a reason even to read it. But then we can see if what is said makes sense. And so that would be the approach to the question of the limits of science that I would take.
But although they understood erosion and sedimentation, the frequent uplifts were a puzzle. By observing and analyzing the rocks of the Appalachians in the 1850s, American geologists deduced that a deep trough in the ocean floor had accumulated sediment over millions of years and then been violently uplifted. They called this trough a geosyncline, and they soon found other mountain ranges in the world that had been formed in the same way. The Peak District of Derbyshire in Britain. Several metres down there's coal, which is the compressed remnants of a hot, swampy forest. Go further down, past a layer of hard grit, and we find a coral reef, which means that further back in time this cold moorland was once a warm, tropical sea. And there's another piece of evidence that has huge implications. During the Ice Age, sea levels fell. Around 10,000 years ago they rose again when the ice melted, drowning valleys and cutting off areas of land. The Bering Strait cut the land bridge between North America and Asia. Indonesia and Britain were isolated, and as we've seen in Human Ancestry Made Easy, all this changed human migration and settlement patterns. The rise in sea level must have flooded coastal settlements all over the world. There perhaps is your mythological flood. A flood that may have had devastating consequences for coastal dwellers, but in global terms was limited. Hardly surprising that a flood figures so heavily in mythologies. At its height, the ice covered 1/3 of the Earth's land surface and was a mile thick. Going through the Earth's sedimentary layers hundreds of millions of years back in time, geologists have also discovered other ice ages. The oldest occurred at the end of the Proterozoic era, 1.1 to 1.4 billion years ago. There was another at the end of the Ordovician, 445 million years ago, and again in the late Carboniferous, 310 million years ago.
Despite the conflict between a catastrophic view of the scablands and the standard view of gentle continuous change, we now know the truth is somewhere in between. There were huge catastrophes that carved out these giant landscape features, but they were part of a cycle of floods that repeatedly swept through this landscape.
The channeled scabland is one of the most fascinating landscapes, and the tremendous catastrophic floods were probably the most spectacular things that happened on the planet. This legacy is part of human history, and I think that it's just an exciting scientific problem.